Okay, my name's Yvonne and I'm an alcoholic. Oh gosh, I'm a little bit over the top here. My heart's pounding away. But there you are, I'm like that. I'm like a mad horse at the start of a race. Anyway, this is not a race here. This is where I come in and I ask God to make me real and make me honest, keep me honest. And because so far so good. One day at a time. I had a wonderful hour out in the garden, and I talk to God when I'm in the garden. And so I'm really feeling quite relaxed about this thing. I've never done this before, but I've talked for an hour, so I reckon I can do for about a half an hour, I reckon. But I was thinking this morning, going right back in my early childhood, I had a specialist doctor tell me that I had insulin resistance. This was a few years back, about 8 years back. And insulin resistance, he said, is a lot of people are born with it. And he said, listening to your story, I'd say you were born with it. And I smiled to myself and I said, you're so right. Because my mother was drunk when she had me. And, you know, and then the years go by, and in 1963, I gave birth to a child in Sydney. And I had to ask the nurse, because I was drunk. And I had to ask the nurse whether I'd had a boy or a girl. I had no recollection whatsoever of giving birth to that child. So there's the disease of alcoholism in one sentence. And it's the family illness, and our family certainly had it. On both sides of our families there are alcoholics and suicides and insanity on both sides, both on my father's side and my mother's side. They were Irish and Scots, with a touch of German thrown in. So I don't know about the German side, don't know too much about them, but they were most likely lunatics of some description. And you know, I know that all I know is that I'm one, and that's all I need to know really. But it's an interesting thing. My sister, I have a sister who's 9 years younger than me. I was born 2 years before the war started, and my sister was born in 1946 when the war ended. So there's 9 years difference in our ages. And she is not an alcoholic. She can either drink or not drink. So it just is one of those puzzling things that no one will ever really be able to answer. But I certainly had all the right makeup. I was sent off to boarding school when I was 5, and in those days boarding schools weren't really a very pleasant place to be. And I remember well getting beaten up by the nuns because I had chilblains, and they used to put my hands in hot salty water and I'd scream, and then they'd belt me across the back of the legs with the ruler. And so I grew up with a lot of trauma and drama, and my poor old mum, she was a violent alcoholic. And sober, she was the kindest, lovingest, loveliest woman, but sober, and I grew up not to trust anybody, really. I grew up with just distrust for the whole bloody world. And the only person in the world that I ever loved or ever felt anything for was my dad. And then he went off and left me and went to war. And so I grew up pretty well bitter and twisted. And then when the war was over, I used to think, well, it'll all be better when the war gets over and Dad comes back from the war. And of course Dad came back from the war and they had my sister, and once more I was on the outside. So then I suffered from jealousy like it was going out of fashion. And I tried to bump my sister off, actually. I pushed her in the... My mother asked me to take her for a walk, and she was only just born. I think she was 3 months or 4 months old or something, in the pram. And I took the pram to the top of the hill and shoved it over to shove, and it went rolling to the bottom of the hill and tipped over. And I ran after it, and I thought, oh, my God. And my mother had tucked her in so tightly that she hadn't come unwrapped. So, oh, God, I was so scared. Anyway, I put her back, put the pram back on its feet and pushed the pram back and pretended nothing ever happened. And I told my sister a few years back that I'd done that, and she was furious with me. She was absolutely furious. I was shocked. I thought she'd take it and think it was funny. She did not think it was funny, I might add. So there you go. But I've learned to deal with a lot of stuff, and I don't know how to tell this story without getting it disjointed, but basically one of the things that always worried me as a child was the fact that my mother used to get drunk and say, with one eye closed, when she got drunk, she always had one eye closed, and she used to say, if it hadn't have been for you, I wouldn't have had to marry your father. And I didn't know what that meant. And then I'd hear them talking. My grandmother would take me away from my mother, and my uncle would take me away from my mother, and my mother would get drunk and give me away to people, and so my life was just one bloody disaster drama after another. And I'd listen at doors and windows and hear them talking, and I'd hear them saying, well, she'd be better off a ward of the state. I can remember my uncle saying, she'd be better off a ward of the state. And I remember thinking to myself, that must mean they're going to kill me. I don't know why I got that idea, but that's what I thought they were going to do. My aunt, my grandmother and my uncle were going to have me bumped off. So mine was survival. That's all I knew, is I knew how to survive. And I knew how to get tough and how to cover up and how to lie and how to never tell anybody what you felt. If you told anybody how you felt, you were in trouble. So you could only ever say how you think. So that's what I did. I made up my mind, I'll only think, I won't feel. And I remember looking at this nun once. She was beating me up, and I looked her right in the eye and I thought to myself, you will never make me cry, ever. So I just clamped my teeth together and I refused to cry. And it wouldn't have mattered what they'd done to me. That's how I learned to survive. As I learned to survive on hatred, revenge. I had a hit list when I got into AA. Man, did I have a hit list. And I think of it now. Oh, God, I can get the slightest bit of resentment today, and it makes me quite ill. I get barbed wire in my gut, and I have to deal with it pretty well straight away because I can't stand it. It just makes me sick as a dog. So I know what hatred and resentments and hit lists look like and feel like, and thank God they're mostly a thing of the past today because I've learnt to deal with it. But anyway, getting back to this horrible bloody story, it wasn't the good old days for me, it was the bad old days. And so I learned to drink when I left boarding school and went out in the big wide world, and of course, first alcoholic that went past felt normal to me because I'd always grown up with this come here, go away stuff. So he was alcoholic, and he was 28 and I was 18, and we got married, and it was a disaster. It was a shotgun job. Married in the Catholic Church. It was just a bloody disaster. And so my first son was born, and my second son was, I was pregnant with my second son when he took off. He couldn't stand the responsibility, I guess, and neither could I, by the way. But my drinking hadn't at that stage got completely out of hand as it was to become later on down the track. At that stage I seemed to have a bit of control over what I was doing. And however, poor old Patrick, he took off and left me pregnant with my second son. And so all the family got together and decided that it was the best thing to do was have this child adopted. So that's what I did. So I had my second son adopted. And anyway, getting back to the story, so I took off after the child was adopted. I took off, left my first son with my sister-in-law, and took off to the Northern Territory to work out in a cattle station because my first son was been born with a hiatus hernia. So he had this vomiting complaint that I was born with, obviously, because I used to vomit too when I was first born. So they said that he'd need to have an operation when he was 3, so I had to go and earn some money for this operation because they were £300 in those days to have this operation on his stomach to fix this hiatus hernia or whatever it was, or hernia of some description. Anyway, I went to the Northern Territory, worked on a cattle station and was getting on okay, but then the son rocked up on the cattle station. He was a drinker, I was a drinker. And I ended up telling the station owners to stick the cattle station, and I ran off with the son. Anyway, it was always, my life was like that. It was just one bloody silly, stupid drama after another. And I was come down to Adelaide, and my son died, my first son died. So then there I was, no children. And then I had the excuse that I needed to be a full-on alcoholic. So then I drank to stop the guilt and the pain, because I really felt inside, even though I didn't admit it to myself, that I had caused my son's death, that I had run away and left him, gone to the Territory, and now he's dead. I didn't think too much of my second son because I knew he'd be all right because he was adopted to good people that were vetted very carefully, and they were good Catholics and all this crap in those days. So that satisfied me that my second son was all right. But when my first son died, I really was in bad shape, mentally and spiritually. So, went to New South Wales. Always did runners, me. I was the greatest geographical this side of the Black Stump. Went to Sydney and got a job and met this millionaire fellow who happened to be my boss, and so I had another son to him, and he paid for divorce, my first divorce, and so there you have it. So there was number 3 son, and there was me. I was then 22. Oh, no, I was 20. I don't know, 63. I don't know, 37 from 63 to 63. I wouldn't have a clue. Somewhere in my early 30s, I think. Something like that. 26? No, sorry, be 20. I don't know, 20 whatever. So my third son was born, but of course I couldn't live in the same house as my son because I thought he was going to die. I would listen to him breathe. I'd sit up at night time and I'd hear him breathe, and I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand it because I knew he wasn't going to breathe again. I knew he'd stop breathing. So I just got drunk. I just absolutely got drunk. I had him home 3 weeks and I took off and left him. Took off up the Queensland coast from Sydney, and came back about 6 months later. Stayed, I don't know how many, it went on for 5 years, just backwards and forwards. I met another bloke, another drunk, and I ran with him for years, and so I married him actually in the end, and after the 5 years I married him, but I kept on going back to my millionaire husband with the son. Anyway, the years were to go on, and of course drinking by that stage had really, you know, starting to take me to the cleaners. I had blackouts and not remembering what happened, and it was really, drinking for me was taking away the reality of my situation, you know, and I really could justify any of my behaviour, absolutely justify it. It was amazing how I could lie to myself and really, really, truly believe it, you know, and really believe it. I wasn't lying when I was justifying my behaviour. I was believing what I was saying, and that's how I was. And I run into that today, you know. I see myself in other people, and I have a lady today that I've been trying to sponsor, I guess, and she varies between 1 week she's alcoholic, next week she isn't. So I understand it. But by God, it's unbelievable that you can be in such a dilemma and really not be able to admit it to yourself that you are in this weak and vulnerable situation. I just believed I was 10 foot tall and bloody bulletproof, and that's the way it was. Sick as a dog with my head in the toilet vomiting. I was still 10 foot tall and bulletproof. But when I was 26, I was dancing on a table or something and fell off and injured myself, and there was a fellow called George B. in Sydney. George Bunting, his name. Is dead now, so it wouldn't matter if I spoke of his name. And he said to me, he shook his head and he said, look, nothing wrong with you, except this is when I was living in Point Piper in the lap of luxury with the little boy, the son. George said, you're an alcoholic and you need to come, George Bunting said, you need to come with me to Alcoholics Anonymous. So I went, and I didn't drink for 8 months in Sydney, and I went to meetings, and I met Father Mike out at Blakehurst, and he told me about getting an annulment from my marriages and and all this good stuff. And I loved being sober, and I loved AA. But then I got a bit bored. I was only 26, and I remember looking around the rooms, and I thought, oh, they're too old. I don't want to sit around here with this mob. Nah, I'll just go out and drink. This was my plan. I remember the thought, I'll just go out and drink for another 2 years, and then I'll come back. I'll be 28 then, and I'll be able to have a bit of a good time, because I really enjoyed, like, I had a Mercedes, and I used to enjoy getting dressed up and going to the Randwick races and living the life of a society woman in Point Piper with the beautiful clothes and the Mercedes and the 3.5 carat diamond. And so I liked all that stuff. It was just false and phony. It's just as phony as me, so it felt right. And so that was my plan. Well, I was to go out and I was to drink on for another 13 years, and I did not get back until I was 39. So I came back into Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 39 in 1977, on January the 12th, 1977. And it was a few months later that I met Gordy, I think. Well, no, we're never terribly sure about this, but I think it was. And there my life changed again, but I'll go back to a bit more of this story. Then I ran off on a tangent. I was working as a secretary. I'd been everywhere and done everything, up to the Territory, over to Queensland, back to Alice Springs, over to Sydney, back down to, it was just madness. It was just madness, absolute madness. And I had all sorts of jobs. But anyway, while I was in Sydney once, I had this really good job. I was secretary to J.D. McDonald. And so there was a pub really close, and I'm never terribly sure what the name of it was, but it was just opposite the Haymarket there. And there was a great barmaid there. She was about 60, and by hell she was a good barmaid. And I said to her, you know, I wouldn't mind becoming a barmaid. And she said, well, jump in here, love, I'll show you how to become a good barmaid. So I started working it there in my after hours when I wasn't JD's secretary. So I liked it. I loved working behind the bar. I didn't have to worry about anything. Everybody bought me booze, and I thought, this is the go. I love this pub business. So I ran away from Sydney. I never ended anything. I never ever resigned or anything like that. I would just vanish. So I threw things in a suitcase and shot through to somewhere up Walker Road, it was, in New South Wales, and got a job as a barmaid up there. There was a job advertised in the paper. So I took the job, and only lasted about a week or so, or a fortnight or something, because the owner of the pub was a complete maniac that had pistols, and he used to sit with his twin pistols shooting things at night time out in the veranda of the pub. And I had no lock on the door. So I remember I quit that job, but anyway, I went back to Sydney and took off again, and it was just, I always felt like I was just a twig in a river. If you see a twig, it gets washed down and it goes from side to side, and whichever way the little inlets of water take it, it goes. And I felt like that, and I didn't give a shit. I just had another drink. People said, oh, they had a terrible time as an alcoholic. Well, I didn't. I had a terrible time for about a half an hour when I woke up in the morning crook sick and felt guilty and ashamed and all that stuff. I felt that till I had a drink, and I can assure you I had another drink, and I didn't feel it. So it was it was just such a awful way to live, because instantly I would have a drink, the pain would be gone. And of course by this time I was a full-on manager of pubs. So I used to manage pubs, lease pubs, rent pubs, whatever I was doing. And I really went from one pub to the other. I had 5 pubs. I ran up to Southeast Asia, and I lived up there and worked for 4 years, and used to run with this mad Texan who was as big as alcoholic as myself. He died. He went back to Texas and kicked the bucket. And I must have had a terrific capacity. I must come from a long line of alcoholics, I believe, because I was tough. And a lot of my friends that I drank with in those last years of my drinking, they all died before I got into AA. One girlfriend, she was a drinking mate of mine, lovely person. She rolled a motor car in Queensland and killed herself. And Daphne, who was also a great mate of mine, she got shot. The boyfriend, or I don't know, whatever happened, but anyway, she came to a sticky end. And we used to terrorize the Territory. We used to drink together and terrorize the Northern Territory, or terrorize the Stuart Highway. But all that, you know, I look back on it, and it's with absolute horror that I could have treated myself so badly. And my reputation, I sold it for a song. And but I didn't ever mean to be bad. I used to pick up drunks and give them jobs in the pub, and then I'd get drunk and sack them next day or something. But you know, I always tried to do the right thing. I always did try to do the right thing, but some of the wheels would fall off. They'd look at me funny, and I'd fire them and that sort of stuff. As any alcoholic will know, we just have that personality change. I do. I have a distinct personality change. My poor sister, when I was living in Southeast Asia, she came up to spend 3 months with me. She came up to stay with me, and Slim, my Texan, and she only stayed 3 weeks, and she left. And it was many years later, I said to her, Jill, why did you only stay 3 weeks when you came up to stay 3 months? And she said, I looked at you one morning and you were standing there with a stubby in your hand. She said, it was like I was looking at Molly. Molly's my mother. Molly's our alcoholic mother. And she said, I just couldn't stand it. She said, I just saw you were exactly the same as Mum. So she said, I just got the next plane back to Sydney. So it's a tragedy of a disease, it really is. I just had a call this morning from my sister, and we've come to a good spot. She became a member of Al-Anon, and she also became an Alateen sponsor. So we often, actually Alateen is a meeting place for us, because I love Hope for Today, the Alateen program, because I'm still a child. I might be 72 on the outside, but I can assure you I'm more like 17, would be more to the point. I'm emotionally not all that mature, so but there's a lot of fun involved in that as well. So anyway, getting back to that horrible point in the last part of my drinking was horrific. I used to go missing for days on end, and I nearly died. I was vomiting up blood when I eventually got down to Adelaide from the Northern Territory. And my last pub was the Daily Waters Hotel, which they closed down on me. The health department and the cops came down from Catherine and said, you're closed, lady, and shut my pub on me. So I said, piss off, I'll drink her out. So I always wanted to say that. I'd practiced that for years. So I did. I drank it out. And I was in very bad shape when I reached Adelaide. And you wouldn't believe it. The miracle of miracles, when I got to Adelaide, my mother was sober, going to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I couldn't believe it. I walked in, the taxi brought me home to their house in Ilberton in Adelaide, and Mum was out in the garden, I think, from memory, and she said, oh, and I got the carton on the hip. And she said, I'll go and see your father, love, he's in the kitchen. And I said, righto. So I said, come in, have a drink with me. She didn't answer. So I went into Pop and I said, what's wrong with Molly? Why won't she have a drink? Because Mum and I were good drinking buddies. You know, we used to drink and fight, and my poor old father used to have me in one arm and Molly in the other, trying to keep us separated. We were going to kill one another. And he'd be saying, girls, 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 and he's trying to stop us. Fortunately, he was a big bloke and he could stop us. But anyway, she'd said, go and have a drink with your father in the kitchen. And when I walked in, I remember what I said to him. I said, Pop, what the hell's happened to Molly? I said, has she got religion or something? And he said, no, she's going to Alcoholics Anonymous. She hasn't had a drink for 6 months. And I went, what? Because I knew about Alcoholics Anonymous, because I'd had that short burst in Sydney the 13 years previous. So there I've got the sober mother, and the house was clean, and the roses were sitting in the vase on top of the piano. The piano was back from the hock shop. It usually spent most of its life in the hock shop when Molly was drinking, because she used to sell it and get money for booze. And so there it was, and the house was clean, and she was around it, and I stayed with her. And as I was at the end of my drinking, and I'd had it. And I was coming home at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I kicking the door down, and all this sort of dreadful behaviour. And my mother never once growled at me. I got a job. I can't imagine how, but I did. I got a job managing a cocktail bar in this brand new cocktail bar in North Terrace in Adelaide. And they thought I was hilarious. I knew the owner of the pub. He was a Territorian. He owned a cattle station, and I had worked for him previously, so I got the job managing this cocktail bar. I only lasted a month because I drank everything on the shelves, you see, and I hadn't paid for it. So as a manager, I had to tally it up, and of course it wouldn't have tallied up because I had drank everything on the top shelf. Anyway, it was like someone said to me in AA, like putting a rabbit in charge of a lettuce patch. And I said, you better believe it, that's exactly what it was like. So I only lasted a month, and I walked in and I said to this woman who was my immediate boss, I said to her, make up my pay packet, please. And she said, why, Yvonne, what's wrong? She said, good heavens. She said, fantastic, look, you're fantastic. We don't need to leave. What's wrong? She said, we'll fix it up. I said, I don't, she was English, and I said, I don't work for pommies, just make my pay up. She just looked absolutely shocked. She looked like she'd been hit on the back of the neck with a piece of big stick. And so she did. She made up my pay and passed me my cheque, and I waltzed out the door. And I was always dramatic, always very dramatic. So there you are. So anyway, it wasn't very long and I'd got hosed out of this pub in North Adelaide. I was a singing drunk sometimes, and I wanted to sing. And they said, please, lady, be quiet, we're listening to the races. It was a Saturday afternoon. And I said, oh, shut up, I'll sing if I want to. I'm a Northern Territory publican, and if I want to sing, I sing. And they said, please, we can't hear the races, because I got a very loud voice in those days. So someone shoved me and I fell over. Anyway, the end of the story was they got the hose, the pressure hose, and they hosed me out of this pub. And next day, I usually had blackouts, but I remembered the whole scenario of getting hosed out of this dreadful pub in North Adelaide. So the next day I said to my mother, as I went past, she was sitting on the couch swinging on the rosary beads, and I said to her, Mum, where's that phone number of that lady that's your sponsor in AA? I said, her name's Phyllis. And she said, oh, it's by the phone, love. She said, it's by the phone. And so I rang Phyllis, and Phyllis said to me, get a large bottle of lemonade and get a taxi, and I'd come straight out here to my place. So I did just that. Spent the day with her and went to my first meeting on January the 12th in 77. And it was the meeting out there, St Bernard's Road, somewhere out that way. I can't remember exactly the name of it. Anyway, there you have it. So that was my journey, start of it. In my recovery, it was very bumpy. I spent the first 2 years and I didn't drink. And I went to meetings absolutely every night. And sometimes I'd go to a lunchtime meeting as well. And then at weekends, I would spend the whole weekends in AA. I used to go from one meeting to the other on a Saturday and do the same on Sunday. So I think that those first 2 years were the most important for me. And I remember someone telling me that. They just said, just put yourself, how often did you drink? And I said, I drank all the time. I was a person that drank all the time. I wasn't always drunk. I wasn't always drink myself unconscious. But I said I drank every day. And about 2 or 3 times a week in the end, I would be unconscious during about twice a week or something. I'd drink myself unconscious, but I was a daily drunk. A daily drinker. So I actually just topped up, really, at all times. And so they said, well, if you drank every day, you go to a meeting every day. And I said, all right, okay. That sounded like good logic to me. And it was the good sense of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was the good sense that appealed to me. You know, it wasn't difficult, it wasn't complicated, it was simple. And the simple messages that I got over the years, they really meant something to me. They just came along at the right time in my sobriety. I remember in Alice Springs, I came home from a meeting and I threw the keys down on the kitchen table and I said, that's it. And there was a couple of AA members up from Adelaide sitting around my kitchen table. And I said, I'm not going to AA anymore. They can stick it. I'm not getting anything out of it. And my sponsor was there from Perth. And she said, well, why don't you just try and go and give something with her reasonable voice? And I remember thinking to myself, good heavens. That had never occurred to me, that I might give something, because I was a taker. If this is not working for me, it's not working, and so I'm not getting anything out of it. So I wanted something to get something. And I was listening to this little lass the other night, on Wednesday night, and she was saying how she's not getting anything out of AA at present, and she's uncomfortable. And I felt like saying, yeah, I know, that's what happens in AA, you get uncomfortable. And that's the time when the fellowship for me worked, when I was getting uncomfortable. I didn't want to hear. So I'd blame it on somebody's hairstyle or the cut of their jeans or something or other, or there'd be something wrong with them and I'd find something wrong with AA and I'd want out of there. But getting back to the history of my disease in my recovery, it was bumpy. As I said, I had first 2 years in 1977, I stayed sober till 79, and then I wasn't sober, but I mean I wasn't drinking, technically. I was pretty screwed up, pretty mad. And I had this terror of being insane, and so I used to skip over that part of the big book where it talked about insanity, and I didn't like step 2, worth a damn. I wasn't going to look at it, but I'd try, and you know, but I thought, oh well, You know, I've run pubs and run businesses and travelled the world. I'm not really as bad as these other alcoholics here. And I'm not as bad as my mother, you know. My mother was mainly wrapped around a flagon all her life. You know, I had run businesses and worked. My mother had never worked. And I thought, well, you know, my mother's a real alcoholic. I'm just slightly alcoholic, even after this most horrific story. And I remember being 3 weeks in AA at a meeting in Port Adelaide at Archway, and I suddenly wasn't an alcoholic. And after the meeting, Semaphore Jimmy came over and he said to me, after the meeting was over, he said, "What did you think of the meeting?" And I said, "Well, I think it's very good, this Alcoholics Anonymous, for my mother." And I said, "I can see how it really works for people, but I'm not actually an alcoholic." And I had just told my story from the floor, and it was a horrific story. I'd get right into my story, but here I am telling the story and then telling the old sober member after the meeting that I'm not actually an alcoholic. And this, I'll never forget what old Semaphore said. "Look, I'm a bachelor," he says, I don't usually take people home, women home to my place, but he said, "In your case," he said, "I think you better follow me home." So I went around to his little flat and he made coffee and we talked until 2 o'clock in the morning. And he had me to the point where I lived opposite a pub. He said, "See if you can go in there for a week and have 2 beers every night for a week and see how you go." And I had enough honesty or enough common sense to know that I wouldn't be able to manage that for a whole week. I might be able to manage it for a little while, but if someone was in there from the territory that I knew, and they'd say, "Good day, old girl, how you going?" And I'd say, "Right, good, let's get a carton," and away I'd go, and it'd be back on again. So he said, "You couldn't do that," and I said, "No, I couldn't. No, I really couldn't." And he said, "Well, you just keep coming back." So it was 2 years down the track. I picked up a drink and put it down pretty quick. Jimmy O.C. rescued me, and then I got another 2 years up. And I was getting closer to reality. I think I was just breaking down. Every time the old ego would get knocked around a bit and I'd get just a little bit more real. And then I got up the next time I got back, I think it was 6 months, or it was getting close on to 5 years anyway. And I fell apart at the seams. I mean, I cracked up proper. Total insanity set in, and I had to seek help. I had to do the full bit. I ended up putting myself in a clinic in Perth in 1983 when we won the Cup from the Americans. And I was in Perth when that happened, and I was in the BSM course then, and that's the Behavioural Self-Management. And there, through psychoanalysis, 2 psychologists were working at the clinic, and a psychiatrist, and all sorts of people, hypnotism, everything. I did the whole lot, everything that went past, I did it. And there they introduced me to myself, and I went into psychic shock for 3 days, and I met my sponsor. And that was the turning point in my life, I believe. But it took the first 5 years of you know, I look back and I know that there's lots of miracles in Alcoholics Anonymous, but I sincerely believe that I was born with the disease of alcoholism, and it goes hand in hand with his insulin resistance, which is I'm allergic to alcohol, which is carbohydrates and sugar, and I would become a diabetic if I didn't change my ways, and I would be dead from alcoholism if I hadn't been able to get relief in Alcoholics Anonymous, and to try to my very best, because I'm not all, I used to think I was intellectual, for God's sake. You know, like, oh, that was my thing. I was very smart in the head, I thought. But it's not in the head, I realise that. You know, I was wanting to learn this and get brownie stars. I was always wanting to be a winner. I wanted to be out there up front. And I wanted to be the best at anything I did. If I took a job on in a pub and I wasn't head barmaid in 3 weeks, I'd quit. I'd quit. I'd absolutely leave and go somewhere else where I could push my weight around and be the boss, because that's the sort of stuff that I had to do. I just had to do it. So, you know, like, it's just a miracle that I've managed to keep on coming back, and I think I've got this dogged determination sort of a nature And I kept on coming back. I remember once I came back in after picnic. This is after the 5 year. This is in the 5 year, after I'd been in AA 5 years, and I said the rot set in. I was back in AA, and I wasn't drinking, but I didn't speak to anyone for 3 months. I sat in total silence, and there was a roundup in Alice Springs, and they all come up from Adelaide to the roundup, and I was on silence. I wouldn't talk. I absolutely refused to speak. So you can believe me, I'm mad, all right. So I love step 2 today. I mean, I'm a step 2 person. I just love step 2. But anyway, down the track, and many good people, and getting a psychiatrist that told me that alcoholics, because I got a thyroid condition, and of course I was shot to pieces with the thyroid condition. This is in 84, 85, and so they gave me pills, get happy pills, and so I don't know, I can't remember, it was Seropax or something like that, and could only stay sober a week on this stuff, and I'd be drunk, and then I'd have 2 weeks. I'd get off the pills, get off the booze. I used to throw the pills away and get on with my drinking, is what I used to do. And so this psychiatrist, it was just as the luck of the draw, it was a new psychiatrist in the Alice Springs Hospital, and he said to me, alcoholics of your type must never take benzodiazepines or psychotropic drugs of any description at all, ever. So that ruled out a whole bunch of the easier, softer ways for me. So I've never touched them since, because I know for me it's absolutely a deadly turnout. I don't tell other people what to do. They can do what they like, but all I can do is tell my story. And I saw my mother. She went from ordinary, run-of-the-mill bloody alcoholic into a raging, dependent upon bloody drugs, and she ended up in methadone, and she slashed her wrists and slashed her throat in the hospital in the nursing home in Adelaide. And it was a terrible thing to see, you know, this poor old lady. She used to go into the DTs as a result of the mongrel pills that they had her on. You know, it was just so cruel to see that happen. And so all I can do is tell my story. I've spoken to the older sober members about this, and they said, keep talking about it because it's your story. And so I do, but it's not I don't lecture anybody today. I used to once upon a time, but I don't do that today. Everybody's got their own journey, and whatever it is, it's none of my business. And Al-Anon's helped me too. I go to Al-Anon as well, because I was affected by the disease of alcoholism before I picked it up. And I, as I said, have had this amazing journey in Alcoholics Anonymous. To me, it's the most amazing story because it's mine. And I got stuck back into my artwork, and I'm an artist that travels all around at the moment. I'll probably get up to Darwin this year because the statues I built in Mataranka have had a big storm hit them and knocked them around, so I've got to go up and do some repair work. But I wanted to see my son, who's a practicing full-on alcoholic and whom I love to pieces. And he's pretty mad, but I love him anyway. And I understand that. And it was the love that got me in AA. It was just the love from the people and the fellowship. And this lady, Val in Adelaide, she gave me this when I first opened my little art shop. I opened an art gallery in Adelaide when I was first sober, and she gave me a little plaque that said I was running around looking for God. You know, God really wasn't lost. It was me that was lost. But I was looking for God everywhere. And she gave me this little plaque and says, God is love. And so it makes me quite emotional thinking about it. But it was the love and the fellowship and the acceptance, you know, of me and my insanity and however mad. I've threatened people in AA, and I look at other lunatics in AA now. Every now and again you get some sort of a person that's quite off the planet. And I thought to myself, well, I was like that. I was completely like that. So I've threatened people. I threatened poor old Irish Kate in Adelaide. I was going to knock her block off. So it was when I was going through a hard time coming to terms with Catholicism. And but I've been through every ism that there is. And it's the old thing where all I know for myself, I'm just a self-centered person that couldn't find self. Self was lost somewhere, but I was completely self-obsessed. and the whole world revolved around me. That's why it's not so hard for me to talk about myself, because that's the only one I can really talk about with any great wisdom. And but I always say that God gave me recovery because He knew full well that I got such a big mouth I'd tell everybody. And so I don't know what in the hell I'm waffling on about here. I'm sitting here looking out at the sky, and that's with a few little twigs and a TV aerial and a chimney, and it's a beautiful, clear, crystal clear morning here, and I'm just so grateful for my life, and I'm making all sorts of plans how to get to Queensland to the convention, and I would love to get up there, so I'm looking for a lift to Queensland. I've got a car, but it needs a new steering rack or some bloody thing. It's going to cost about $800. So I've got to get that fixed before I go, and I don't know if my bus would make it over that way. And apart from that, I've got to go north instead of going east. So I don't know, whatever. So I'm sure God's got the answer, but I can do that today. I can let go of those decisions and say, well, I'm just not making the decision at the moment. So and I'll let God have a finger in the pie and just give me a bit of a nudge and a bit of direction, and no doubt it'll all unfold, and that's how it is for me today. And I'm not an expert on anything, except I do know a bit about me, and I know that I'm okay. I can live with me, and it's peaceful where I live. It's peaceful on the inside, and by God, it wasn't for a lot of years. It was, I'm not getting anything out of AA. Well, AA gave it to me whether I wanted it or not. Jimmy O.C. used to say he got it through osmosis. And I think I get this bloody turnout through osmosis as well, because it starts to mean more as I get older. You know, it means more, there's more beauty around, you know, like there's just such absolute beauty, you know, like it's just such a transforming thing that I see in Alcoholics Anonymous. I see them come in pretty bad shape, and then I see them in a year later, and they're transformed. They don't even look the same. They don't even look like the same people, and they certainly don't even sound like the same. You know, it's so inspirational. It is just so wonderful to be able to get in there and share from the gut, you know, and my God love my sponsor. You know, she was so understanding, and she knew where I was coming from. And she said to me, all right, now how do you feel about step one, when I'd had a bender and I had to come back in with the tail between the legs? And I said, I think. And I was about to go into my spiel. And she said, I don't want to hear what you think. I want to know how you feel. Do you feel unmanageable? Do you feel powerless? And until I could get that, you know, I was just lost. Couldn't, because I was shut down in those areas, and so I couldn't recognise my weakness. And I know today how absolutely, totally vulnerable and weak I am. And if I'm feeling vulnerable and weak, I put off my work, or I'll just shut it down. No, not doing that. I don't have to have an excuse. I don't have to make excuses. I'm just not doing that today. And people say, why, is something wrong? I said, no, not necessarily. It's okay. I'm just not doing it today. I don't have to explain myself, but I know myself that when I'm not travelling well and I'm asked to go and work in a pub or do something like that, I can say no. And but I'm not frightened of the booze today. But if I don't put myself in vulnerable positions when I'm feeling in a weakened state, you know, there was a death of my friend up here, and I was quite shaken by that, and I just took great care of myself. You know, my sponsor taught me to be my own best friend. She said to me, all right, you just got to learn to be your own best friend. You know, I was able to come through cancer because I learned how to become my own best friend, and I didn't drink. With the help of Alcoholics Anonymous, I stayed sober right throughout that whole thing, came through the divorce of my husband without picking up a drink, and I got married in AA, and that was a very traumatic thing for me to do, and come through that without picking up a drink. And it's all because Alcoholics Anonymous, I was able to make that commitment to myself and to the fellowship and to the spiritual recovery part of the program. And I don't know how long I've talked because I've been gazing outside, so I just better have a look at the time. Oh my God. Anyway, one morning I woke up in Iron Knob when I was living out there in the bush, and I was laying in bed thinking about the steps. I was just laying there all cuddled up. And you know, this came to me in one flash. Like, this is impossible for me to be able to do this. I'm not a writer of prose, or I'm not a writer, but this came to me in one hit, and I sat down at my kitchen table in Iron Knob and I wrote it straight out. And so I'm just going to close with this steps prayer, and it goes as follows. God, help me accept my powerlessness and unmanageability, my insanity so profound, my wholehearted decision to give you my life and my will. May I look honestly at my stock in hand. May I be able to let go of my defects and shortcomings so destructive. May I make a list of all persons past and present that I've harmed and make sincere amends. May I take a daily stocktake and choose to be a loving person. I seek through prayer and meditation God's will for me, and may I carry this message to all. So thank you very much for listening, folks. I hope you haven't all gone rigid, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.